Australians don't often go in for self-aggrandisement. We don't big note ourselves. And that means that we're not really aware of the resources that we have. We do have remarkable resources in our culture that we've gained over the time. A spirituality. And I want to speak about that, reflect on it, help you to find confidence in that spirituality. Les Murray, the great Australian poet, says, "We have a tune the world could whistle." So it's a very big claim, isn't it? But he thinks that we've worked out a way of life, a way of living together, a way of facing life that the whole world could share in. Now, what is a spirituality? To be a human being is to have depth, the present Pope says. There are yearnings, there are hopes, there are drives, dynamisms, needs, mystery. And a spirituality gets in touch with that dimension of our being. So that we have a spirituality, and we want to reflect upon what that is, where it's led us. Of course, we don't do it alone. We belong to a culture, we share in a culture, we benefit from a culture, our view of life is much influenced by the culture in which we live. So, being human is like waking up in a strange place. We don't know where to go, what our bearings are. But we find there are other people there with us, and they have their scripts, they have their directions, they point out the way they think we should go. And that's what it is to be in a culture. We share with other people a way of life, and we're all trying to find the way together. We glimpse the way forward, but we're struggling. And that's part of being human, that struggle. And what the outcome of that is the sharing in the project of making something of life. We have complex scripts. Our Australian culture is a derivative culture. I'm speaking of Australians who've come in the last couple of centuries, not the indigenous who've been there many, many, many centuries before us. But those of us who belong to our culture have complex scripts. We brought a lot with us, a lot of baggage from the old world. But also we have scripts that have been made here. People who've interpreted life, found a meaning for life here, they contribute to the scripts that we have as we try to make our way forward. There's no stereotype Australian. I'm speaking of the Australians of the last couple of 100 years. Sometimes people tend to think there's a stereotype, the suntan bushman or the surfy or the digger or whatever it is. There's really no stereotype. If you're here and you want to make a go of it and you share in what we learn together, you're an Australian. It's very important for us to realise that. We come in all shapes and sizes and backgrounds and outlooks, but if you're here and you want to be here and you want to make a go of it, you're a genuine Australian. That comes out in the story of Henry Lawson. Henry Lawson is one of the great interpreters of our Australian way of life, what we've been learning along the way. And in one of his stories, he tells of an Australian who was in a New Zealand coach, 19th century story, and he's sounding off. It's a mongrel desert country. It's a God-forsaken country, the worst I've ever seen. The thing I hold against it is that I was born there. And an Englishman who's in the coach begins to join in the criticism and soon finds that it wasn't the right thing to do, because this man's going home. Even though it's God-forsaken, it's his home, and in the end, in a strange paradoxical way, he loves it. So it brings out what we said. Being here, wanting to be here, and wanting to make a go of it. Let's now consider an important component of what we've learned, our culture, the battler spirit. That's a very basic component of our Australian spirituality. You can call our spirituality our best self. We've learned a lot of things. We don't always react as we should, and there's a lot of selfishness and confusion in us too, all of us, but there's our best self. And our best self is the ideal that we really want to hold up, we want to identify with, we want to make our own. And we need to own it. There's the tune that the world can whistle if we find it and identify with it. Vance Palmer, one of the first interpreters early in the 20th century of what we've learned as Australians, said, we carry our history in our bones. See? Somehow that the culture we have, our outlook, is formed by what's happened to us. The history we've lived together in this strange, unusual continent. It's interesting to make a comparison between Australia and the United States. Their very history invites comparison. The main history of the United States and our history are during the same period. We're about the same area. We've both began as colonies of the British, but very soon the comparison breaks down and becomes quite a contrast. Our nationhood. The American nation was founded by proud pilgrim fathers, free people going to safeguard their freedom in a new land. The nationhood was established by a dramatic declaration of independence. We began as a convict settlement. And we became a nation when the colonies that had emerged from these convict settlements found it more convenient to come together for purposes of excise, trade and defence and so forth. The land, America. The land promised an exciting, magnificent repeat of European experience, the same kind of climate, the same kind of terrain, same agricultural methods applicable. And as they moved in, they found a rich and wonderful country, so fertile. Our land, so different. Everything seemed upside down, so barren. The extremes of flood and drought. The dead heart, when they went to seek the wealth of the interior, all they found was the strange dead heart of our continent. And then the ideals of Americans and Australians. The ideal American is full of enterprise, optimism, an achiever. The best Australian is a survivor. It's going to be difficult. And we've got to keep our energy. We haven't got energy to waste on just the thrill and the joy of the quest. We keep our energy for what lies ahead, because we don't know what lies ahead. And our heroes, America's heroes, larger than life, George Washington, Abe Lincoln, frontiersmen. We've got a strange lot of heroes. Burke and Wills, explorers who failed. The Anzacs, a disastrous military campaign. The bushrangers. Ned Kelly, what a strange hero. We have a strange lot of heroes, very different from the clean skin of the American tradition. The Battle of Spirit must have begun in a lot of anguish. There's an illustration of an early 19th century settler. He's overcome with despondency. The wife and family are trying to urge him on to do something, get up and do something about it. If he did, maybe he ended up like this man in a Roberts painting, sitting on his tree trunk with his hut in the background, looking at the beautiful sky, glad that he's here, he's going to make a go of it. The Battle of Spirit made Australians resourceful. Australian inventors and scientists are remarkable in their representation in the world. There was a saying in the 19th century, you can fix anything with some iron bark and some wire. That resourcefulness out in the country, in a far-flung district, farming and surviving, Australians became very, very resourceful. And they had to face terrible extremes. Judith Wright tells of her grandfather up in central Queensland. At one time he's digging into the sand of the creeks to try to get some water for his cattle. A couple of months later, a flood sweeps all his fences away. Like no one in Europe expected these extremes, even envisaged the sort of extremes conditions that Australians would have to face. And then the battler spirit made Australians courageous. When our young men went off to the First World War, there was great apprehension. These are country boys. They've never seen the horror of war. What will happen? And then they're thrown into the Gallipoli campaign, and they were magnificent. They won the admiration of the world. So the battler spirit, learning to face difficulty and challenge, had made them into fine young men who shone when they had to face the ordeal of the world stage. So we've found a wisdom. Wisdom is getting in touch with experience in a way that really meets the deepest needs of our destiny, of our makeup, what we're made for. So there is a wisdom. We carry it in our bones, this wisdom. Most of us live in the city. We're not country people. We're out there. We're fighting the floods and the bushfires. But we've learned that same wisdom. We've been through depressions. One of the things, Australia is terribly vulnerable to changes in the world market. Depression at the end of the 19th century, world market collapse caused terrible hardship in Australia. And then the Great Depression of the 20s and 30s, Australians survived, they helped one another, they got through it together. So there is something there very, very remarkable, our best self. Well, this comes out very well in a debate that took place in the Bulletin, 1892. Two of the leading writers in early Australian literature, Banjo Paterson and Henry Lawson, entered into a debate. The Bulletin was a phenomenon in Australian experience. Those who founded it had the creativity, insight to make it involve the readership. So people contributed, all kinds of people contributed. And so there's an ongoing conversation. It became the Bushman's Bible. All the Bushmen read it, waited for it to come, talked about what was in it. People in the country shared in the whole thing. It's an Australian register of experience and debate and outlook. So Banjo Paterson was the most popular writer of poetry for a long period in Australia. The man from Snowy River and so forth. His view was a romantic view. The bush was like an Eden, a pure, innocent place where people maybe will find themselves one day. There's the ideal that out in the bush you'll find yourself. There's the true Australia. There's the ideal Australia. Henry Lawson was sent by the Bulletin to look at the bush in Western New South Wales and do some writing. And he came back and wrote a ballad that made fun of Paterson's view. You have the lines, "I burnt a lot of fancy verses. Now I'll stay in town, drinking beer and cooling down." He'd seen the bush. He'd seen the hardship of the bush. People lived desperate lives in many instances in the bush. They didn't have comfortable homes, lived in makeshift shanties, men, women and children making a life together. Bad planning in the selections, the properties taken up, meant that many people failed, all their hopes were lost. Lawson doesn't look down on these people. A lot of his stories are about the qualities of these people. But he's criticising this romantic view. Judith Wright, our great woman poet, said, Patterson stood for a paralysing legend. It wouldn't help Australia, really, to dream that there's a need out in the bush. Whereas Lawson stood for a challenging realism. Face the real conditions of people in the bush and let's find a way together. That debate reminds me of Albert Facey, a great West Australian. What a story that he calls A Fortunate Life. What a life. A wretched childhood, exploited as a child, as sort of child labour on a farm that he'd been sent to. He goes to Gallipoli. He's incapacitated by an exploding shell, but for years after the war, he got no pension because the doctors had not made a final diagnosis of his condition. Finally then, it was diagnosed. He became a worker on the tramways and raised a family and wrote his story, and someone saw how wonderful it was and encouraged him to publish it. And he called it A Fortunate Life. He is an Australian battler who's maintained his dignity and comes through as a magnificent human being despite all the setbacks of life. In Australia, if you sell a couple of thousand books, you've done very well. Albert Facey's book sold 500,000 copies. Humour is a great expression of national character, and our humour is quite remarkable. Les Murray says, the humour of the ordinary common people is very often suppressed because the establishment isn't interested in it. But here, well, we've never had such an establishment. It comes out into the open and flourishes, the ordinary humour. There you have probably the most famous cartoon that's appeared in Australian newspapers. It appeared at the time of the Depression. And the one, obviously the scaffolding's collapsed and this fellow's grabbed the other fellow's legs, his trousers have come down, and the words are, for God's sake, stop laughing, this is serious. So, impossible situations, but they won't get us down. We'll still keep a smile on. There's the spirit of Australian humour. It's the expression of the battler spirit. I'll tell you a story that really happened. I met the man to whom this happened. He became a Church of Christ minister, but when he was young, he was a bit of a scallywag, and one day he and his mate went out onto the railway line in Brisbane outside their backyard with their guns, and they put on handkerchiefs and stood on the line when the train came clanging along, and the train had to stop. And the kid said, this is a stick-up. And the driver said, this is a kick up the arse when I talk to your father. No words wasted. Like, you don't waste energy, it's laconic and dry and straightforward. Another thing about Australian humour is it's helped people to share in the difficulties and the often unrewarding situation. You probably know the story of Henry Lawson, a story about gold diggers who are getting nowhere, and they decide that they'll put one of their explosive they made into a waterhole to get some fish. But a playful retriever grabs the explosive and keeps chasing after them. They take off to town, come into the pub where suddenly everyone was asleep, but suddenly there's a tremendous reawakening. All the dogs in town are following the other dog. It gets under the hotel, and finally it runs out, and there's an almighty explosion and a great diminution of dog population in the town. Well, See, that's against the background of unrewarding situation. It's a way of somehow getting things together, making something of the moment. Another thing about Australian humour is that impossible situations, as we said, won't get us down. There's a picture of the Anzacs of Gallipoli who've been evacuated, and now they're going to the Western Front. They're showing their spirit. In the Second World War, Australian troops in North Africa marched into battle singing, "We're off to see the wizard." A spirit that'll get us through. And it's the humour we share that helps us and gives expression to that spirit. You'll excuse the language of this next one, but it's an absolutely classic joke. A bulletin man was sent up to Wyndham on Cambridge Gulf to write about it. He arrives in the pub, and they all know he's from the bulletin. They're all up the other end, and he's all by himself down his end. So one comes up and says, "So you came to write about us, mate, did you?" "Well, I'll tell you what to tell them. Cambridge Gulf is the arsehole of the world, and Wyndham's 65 miles up it." Another thing about Australia, it's levelling. It puts people in their place, and so don't take themselves too seriously. And often the landowners, the people who had big properties, they thought they were like the aristocracy in England, and they had to be put in their place. So here's an illustration of that time, and there's a story of the swaggy who's overtaken by the landowner in his gig on a dusty country road, and he says, want a lift?" He says, "No, you can open your own gates." Les Murray sums it up, as I said. He says, "Our humour puts tragedy, futility and vanity in its place." And it's the irony of working class humour, the ordinary working people, the irony that never finds full expression often in culture, here it flourishes. Let's now consider another important component of our best self, the fair go attitude. Everyone should have a fair go. It had its origins in our convict beginnings. You can imagine how a colony in which the vast majority of the population were ex-convicts was a bit against authority and very sensitive about issues of justice. How many convicts do you think came to Australia? 168,000 convicts came to Australia. That's a surprise to most people. Most people think a few thousand, maybe 10,000. You can imagine how the influence that they had on our developing culture. And then after their emancipation, their children grew up within a convict family. And of the convicts who came to Australia, 40% were flogged in a most inhuman flogging system. We carry our history in our bones. Something of that is still there in our makeup. We're very sensitive to questions of justice, especially when they affect ourselves. Australia was very early a very urbanised country. Late in the 19th century, Sydney and Melbourne were the 13th largest cities in the world. It's quite a paradox, isn't it? So it was a country living by a rural economy, but most people lived in the cities. But there was a kind of bond between the city people and the bush. The bush became a symbolic thing for Australians. As R.M. Crawford, one of the first great historians who interpreted our history and our culture, says that Australians are not town lovers. We might be town people, but we're not town lovers as in some European countries. People love their town. The town life is their very life. They're really in another culture from the people in the country. But here, we're not town lovers. We have a romantic but non-sentimental attachment to the bush. The bush seems to stand for what is distinctive in us, and it's probably part of our breaking our links with the old world. For a long time, the British had quite a large influence on Australia and its outlook. And this was resented by Australians as our national outlook developed. And so what was most un-British was the bush, and especially that independent spirit of the people in the bush. So that became symbolic for us. From a very early date, visitors to Australia remarked on this egalitarianism. In about 1830, a man named Harris arrived, and on his first night in Sydney he went down to a tavern and was astounded. All these people from different backgrounds, working men and property owners, all they were, and they all seemed to be on the same level. He'd never seen anything like it. And so you have a whole series of visitors who remark upon this egalitarian spirit. It's a very wonderful tribute made in the 1880s by a man named Adams, who was a friend of Matthew Arnold, the great educationalist in England. And he said, there's something wonderful about this country. He criticised the way they were all interested in horses and dancing and that sort of thing, and he thought this was outrageous. But there's something wonderful about the country. He said, in England, the typical person is subservient. In America, the typical person is superior. But here, the typical person is an equal. Here, people are free, and they show their respect for themselves in the respect they have for one another. It's a tremendous tribute, isn't it? And again, reminding us of our best self. As politics developed, there were conservatives and progressives, but it was a conservative politician who said, in this country, everyone must have a fair start in life. It's taken for granted, this basic equality. Australia was called a social laboratory in other countries. In Europe, those who want to reform the abuses of society looked to Australia and admired the things we did. In 1908, we introduced the basic wage, a world first. Within a couple of years, we introduced pensions for the elderly and the invalids. We introduced the arbitration system. Rather than having conflict of industrial turmoil and more powerful win, a system whereby it was arbitrated to try to find an equitable way of life in our society. But there's been a shadow side to this. Again, the government spirit. What we said about the convicts shows up in this, again, the government spirit that there we've always got to keep it in check. There you have a policeman and a bushman in confrontation. There's no doubt where the sympathy of the cartoonist lies. The policeman, it's not a very kindly portrayal, and the bushman there is standing as a hero with his foot on the stump. The shadow side is also a culture of exclusive male outlook, mateship. Whatever's admirable in that culture, and there is a lot that's admirable in it, it also has its shadow side. In the 1820s, there was only one female to every 3 males in Australia. That's only 20 years before the gold rushes. And then the gold rushes brought a tremendous influx again of male population. Males socialised together, lived and worked together. In that jig, blokes who've worked together are now going to enjoy themselves together. That's a 19th century illustration. These are bush workers who've got their check and now they're going to really make whoopee with what they have. They yarn together. There's a portrayal of bushmen all males, living in the outback, in the conditions that they took for granted. But there's a socialising, there's a special outlook that is a male exclusive club developing. They grew up together. There you have Robert's painting of the sunny south. Thinking of Europe, we're in the south. Here's the sunshine, and there young people grow up together and play together. A man named Terry Colling wrote a book, Beyond Mateship. It's a very, very perceptive analysis. And he says this male culture was all directed to an external adversary. And that's where our problems arise from. The convict system, the authorities, were all together against this adversary. The land, the struggle to survive in the land. We're together in this struggle. He says, therefore Australian males are deprived of that exploring of the inner resources that they have. And that's part of the crisis of our own time, that males are now trying to find themselves and to find those inner resources that they need to survive in today's world. He says, Australians became magnificent troops precisely because of this psychology of the exclusive male culture directed to an adversary. Most peoples, when they enlist their troops, have to train them. They've got to get used to doing what they're told, even brutalised. But Australians just went straight into the army and straight into battle and acquitted themselves well because they're attuned to the external adversary. As we speak of the fair go, we must raise the question of multiculturalism. And there's much discussion and debate, even doubt about whether it's a valid concept. I think this is tragic. It's the most important concept and one that we must understand and own in a true sense. Before World War II, there was an interaction of different cultures in Australia. The British, the Irish and the Scots. But they were carrying on the debates and the fights and the interaction that they had for centuries. So they made a culture that was very intolerant. The white Australian culture was terribly intolerant. There you have a document about prohibited immigrants who were being sought by the authorities. That was the spirit of this white Australia prior to the Second World War. After the Second World War, Australia realised they needed an influx of population. So they recruited immigrants from Northern Europe in the first period, from the Mediterranean and Middle East, and then from Asia. And from that came a wonderful society. We have our little problems, but I think the multiculturalism of Australia, properly understood, is a tremendous achievement. And it's due to our best self, welcoming people, appreciating the battler spirit, fair go for everyone. So multiculturalism is a genuine and very valid and important concept. But it must involve not merely coming together and everyone does their own thing and we'll live happily ever after, but those who come to this country must be happy to be here and to give it a go. They have to identify with our core values, our true self. That's not asking much, they're just basic human values that made Australia what it is. And anyone who wants to be here and give it a go has to identify with those values. But then our culture will evolve, inevitably. We won't be fixed always, and some cultures evolve constantly. And it'll evolve with contributions from other traditions that will make it a wonderful culture in which the fruits of true multiculturalism can be shown to the world. Let's now consider the testing of our true self, and especially in our relationship with the Indigenous people of Australia. Our true self has been tested, and we're still trying to find our way through this test. It was inevitable that the two cultures should have great difficulty in relating to one another. It can never be claimed that it wasn't right for other people to migrate to Australia. The Aboriginal people had a right to their land, but they didn't have an exclusive right. That this land in a world population had to be shared. So there was nothing unjust in our coming to share the land, but it was the way in which it took place, the almost inevitable misunderstandings between two cultures that have caused tragic and very painful problems. The Aboriginal people are the most remarkable people on the face of the earth, living in isolation for 50, 60, 70, 80,000 years. Incredible. No other people have lived in such isolation, such a long tradition, and found their way of life in that isolation as these people have. And their long experience gave them remarkable qualities that we can admire. A sort of Franciscan sense of poverty and sharing. They only have what they can carry with them, which is not very much. Whatever they have, they share. That's been their tradition. There's a great story of the Aboriginals of Botany Bay meeting Captain Cook's men, and they brought with them trinkets and very bright buttons and beads and things, and gave them to the Aboriginals, and they were fascinated with them and crowded around and all looked at them and took them. Then as they left, they just dropped them. We'd have put them in our pockets. We'd have been far more acquisitive than they were. They had a system of justice, tribal justice, which was very sensitive. If someone had committed a crime that needed to be punished, he had to go through an ordeal. Those who were accused or wronged could throw spears at him, and he could only defend himself with a small shield. If it was a very serious crime, they would try to inflict a lethal wound. If it was less serious, they would go for his limbs. This was the way in which they settled their disputes. Tribal conflicts were very regulated. They weren't all in mayhem, slaughter, but once sufficient casualties had taken place that people felt justice had been done, they called it off. And then their relationship with the land, famous relationship with the land. They'd lived with the land, they venerated the land, they survived through the land, they related to the land, their whole dreaming mythology was about the land, identification with the land. There was something admirable there. It was their way of reaching out for the ultimate mystery of life. So all these things were theirs, but it was such a fragile culture to come into conflict with our vigorous, demanding, imposing culture. Sociologists have spoken of the usurper mentality. See, colonialism was widespread in the world, wasn't it? The powerful European nations came to exploit, to spread, and a special mentality inevitably developed, where they were insensitive to the rights of the others, they were demanding, unjust very often, selfish, and so forth. There you have a poignant portrayal of that. Very early painting in Sydney. It's prior to 1820. There you see an Aboriginal family sitting near Colonist's house, and Colonist standing on the veranda, rather proudly. And there's a tragedy. These people's way of life's been completely disturbed, and almost impossible for each group to understand the other. Bernard Smith said, "Our culture is a struggle to be human and to remain human." Bernard Smith was a great art critic, Australian art critic, and gave the Boyer lectures on the Aboriginal question one year. And he says, we all belong to a culture, and a culture is trying to help us be human. But then, as the culture faces difficulties, we must remain human in the challenges that we face. And the usurper mentality made it hard for us to remain human in our interrelationship with the blacks. There you have a portrayal by a white, early 19th century artist of a massacre of blacks. And they're the settlers on their horses with guns, and the blacks with only their spears to defend themselves being shot in the water. And often the outcome, white man's justice. These people couldn't understand why all this happened, why they were treated in the way they were. They were merely trying to survive and trying to uphold their own traditional values. Very, very confusing situation. So as I say, it was almost inevitable great problems should arise, but we must be realistic as we look back. We can't blame the people of the time in the way in which they did these things today. We understand their difficulties and the bias that was there in their minds, but we must be honest as we face the whole thing. We are now interacting in a way which, please God, will be productive. All learn from it, this interaction between white and black. There's potential there for us to become more human and for them to find their way forward in their own development. But they must determine their own future. We cannot lay down what the future should be for them. They are free human beings with their dignity and their rights, and every culture in its way has its rights. It would be unrealistic to think that they'll live by their culture forever and ever. But they have to make that decision. They must evolve and take their place in an evolved society with us. There's a wonderful quotation from 1988, in which Prime Minister Hawke met with Aboriginal elders. One of the elders made this statement, which I think we should all bear in mind. It's a wonderful, generous and hopeful statement. Today there are lots of people living in this country. This is their country too now. He says their mothers were born here. I've left that bit out in the quotation. We have to look after each other. We have to share this country. We have to share this country with one another. Let's now think of the land, the great symbol of all these things that we hold in common. Our Australian outlook's been formed in this land. And so the very peculiar characteristics of this land and its style and its all that it is a symbol that we love. It means so much to us. It didn't come easy to accept Australia. Most Europeans were depressed when they saw everything so different. The first Anglican Bishop of Sydney wrote in his diary that his heart sank when he saw the trees on Sydney Harbour. No green, just drooping leaves. It's so depressing. And many had the same impression from the gum leaves. D.H. Lawrence said, rubbery, no reflection. It's so unlike European leaves. Yet now, the gum tree, what a symbol. There's Hans Heyssen's romantic portrayal of the gum tree, of the drover in the sunset, driving through the gum trees. That touches all of us. We're all touched by that picture, because the gum trees and all those things associated with Australia, the wattle and the outback and the Uluru, and it all speaks to us. It all reminds us of all that we stand for and all we hold together. Margaret Preston was a great Australian painter, and in one of her portrayals of trees, she used an Aboriginal style. That shows how far we've come from that first reaction to the strangeness of the Australian bush to a time when we can begin to look at it even through Aboriginal eyes. It took us a long time to come to terms with the land, but as it did, in our bones something emerged, an outlook, an identification. We're identified with the land. And here's a wonderful statement from the Mrs. Gunn, who wrote We of the Never Never. That elusive land with an elusive name, Never Never, she has in mind. A land of danger and hardship and privations. It loved as few lands are loved. A land that bewitches her people with strange spells and mysteries until they call sweet bitter and bitter sweet. Everything turned upside down. But We love it. We identify with it. We wouldn't have it any other way. We're proud of it. We'll have our own images of the land. It's like an icon. An icon's an old, very ancient representation. And it's strange at first, and people have to study it. But as they come to understand it, as they come to look at it, it begins to reveal great things to them. And they come to love it. The Australian continent is like an icon for us. In this final section, we'll look at the way in which the Christian faith has related to the Australian outlook. It hasn't been an easy relationship. And from the time of the convicts, problems began. The chaplains who came out with the convicts were looked upon by the convicts as agents of the establishment. Therefore, a distrust, an alienation from the practicing institutional Christianity became part of our outlook. And the very ethos of the time really went against us. Manning Clark, the great historian, said that Christian faith has become for most Australians a whisper in the mind and a shy hope in the heart. It's a magnificent summing up of our attitude. People really still have that shy sense that they're Christians and they stand for that Jesus is the Saviour and we must live by his teaching and example, but it's a shy and private thing that is in danger of being lost. See, at the time of Federation, 99% of Australians said they had a religion. The vast majority were Christians. That's eroded away now. Still the majority would say they are Christian. But it's a Christianity that can't express itself, that's shy to express itself, that's uncertain of what it really means and what it calls for. Part of our problem was the fact that the churches didn't make any attempt to enculturate into our Australian condition, didn't relate to the ongoing story and experience. Like in our own Catholic tradition, wasn't that so? We just brought an Irish Western style of Catholicism and carried it on. There's very little attempt to relate it all to what was happening here and the ordinary people's lives. What was more, the churches brought out their sectarian squabbles, bitter squabbles. There you have a 19th century cartoon portraying a cleric with his tract in his pocket, waving his umbrella and wagging the finger at people. That's the view that the clergy won for themselves. They don't say deserve, had won for themselves. Because so this emerging Australian outlook wanted to leave behind the squabbles of the old world. They said that explicitly. We don't want to bring in the problems of Europe here. We're making our new world. That was a very real aspiration, quite clearly articulated by people who were trying to express what Australia stood for. So when they saw these old squabbles going on, it really undermined again any sense of confidence in our Christian tradition. But despite all this, some of the visionaries, and I'll quote a couple now, who were trying to dream what Australia could look for, looked to the Christian gospel as the measure. It's quite remarkable and encouraging to us. Manning Clark wrote a biography of Henry Lawson, In Search of Henry Lawson, trying to understand Henry Lawson. And he points out how often a Christian motive comes through in Lawson's writings. He's got one magnificent story about a bush preacher who comes to a divided community, bitter. There's a bitter feud going on in this community, and he wants to heal it. And he describes how he does it. He says, there was a haunting sympathy in his brown eyes. And he talked to these people. He didn't tell them that things would be better. People had lost their properties through the drought and walked off and left a dusty patch in the bush. He didn't tell them things would be better, but he said that there was beauty in their lives, beauty in this strange country they lived in. And then with a real Lawson touch, the story ends with the singing of "Shall We Gather at the River?" And he said there wasn't any river nearby except a few dried up water holes every mile or so. There's a real Lawson touch to the end of the story. So the Christian gospel, Lawson saw as a measure. As Manning Clark says, Christ was always somewhere in the background in Lawson's vision for Australia. And another self-taught visionary and writer was Joseph Furphy. Both Lawson and Furphy were self-taught, and they were visionaries. They wanted to understand Australia and give expression to what it stood for. And Furphy wrote a book called Such is Life. They're the last words, according to the record, that Ned Kelly uttered. And this book is exploring what Australia stands for. He's got Tom Collins, a bushman who's travelling around on his job and meeting all kinds of people, and all their conversations and what they've got to say about what's going on is all recorded here, and it's all trying to find out what it's all about. The wonderful passage comes to mind when we're talking about this is that for Furphy, and these are his words, the sunshiny Sermon on the Mount is not an impractical code, but a code that any civilization could live and would find what life is really about. Isn't that a magnificent statement from a bushman who didn't go to church, who'd been raised within a Protestant denomination, but had given up because he didn't think the Christians were really living up to what they professed. And in another passage he says, "The light of the world, the only God we can ever know, is by his own authority represented for all time by the poorest of the poor." Jesus. Here's the blueprint. Can we have a blueprint? That's what both of these men are asking. Can Australia have a blueprint? Can all our struggles and our hopes and our experience lead to anything? And both of them turn to the Christian gospel. It's tremendously encouraging for us. Australians are reluctant to speak about their religious convictions. We've all experienced that. It's an embarrassing subject. Don't bring it up. But Australians aren't anti-religious. Certainly until the recent past they haven't been anti-religious. They're just not sure, standoffish. They respect, the typical Australian attitude has been to respect those who are religious, but I don't want to get involved. I'm not quite sure, where it'll all lead. Tony Kelly, a great Australian theologian, says this is the beginnings of wisdom. It's not rejection, it's just hesitation, waiting to find the words to talk about things that are so important. There's great wisdom in that. Like people who talk always about God, well, you wonder how much they know about God really, and the mystery of God, whether they've really faced the mystery of God. If we're always talking about God and got God in a box and God all summed up, well, we really haven't come to know God. Tony Kelly says, this perhaps is the beginning of wisdom, waiting to find the words to express. It's an optimistic view. Please God, it's true that we've still got those resources in our makeup, and that we can, as Australia moves forward into its future, this can be realised. We can articulate for them what they need to hear. If you reflect upon it, the values we have, our best self, resonates with the gospel story, doesn't it? The suffering servant, the way of Jesus, the poor man, the man who saved the world through the cross. Like, it's not triumphalism, not a great triumph and display that brought the salvation of the world, but the way of Jesus. And that way is so close to our values. Our values, we should have spoken of this more, we should have shared this more, we should have helped people, we should have taken the lead from Lawson and Furphy and shown people that our Australian way is so in tune with the gospel. There you have an early Australian piece of art, and it reminds me of that saying in with the prophet Isaiah that we quote on Good Friday, speaking of the Saviour. Like a sapling he grew up before him, like a root in arid ground. There's the prophet's way of summing up Christ's work. Well, we've lived in this strange continent. We've known droughts and aridity and setbacks. There is beauty in this land, as Lawson's preacher said, and we'll find it if we open our hearts to it. Let's conclude by just reflecting on national humility. There's not much evidence of it in the world, is there? Nations don't normally express humble acknowledgement of their shortcomings. Yet, if only they did. If only the great nations of the world could say, we are great, we have achieved great things, but we know we have a shadow side. We know we are self-serving in many ways. We want to understand that, and we acknowledge it before the world. They wouldn't lose, they would be strengthened. Now we too, I think, from our strange history, we can have a humility. We can acknowledge our shadow side, our failings, but we can also gratefully acknowledge the blessings we've received. And they are great blessings. Quoting Les Murray, we have a tune the world can whistle. We're not out there in the outback. We're living in houses like these terrace houses, 19th century terrace houses. Sydney and Melbourne, the most urbanised cities in the world. We're not bushmen, but we have a sympathy for the bush because it symbolises so much of that history we carry in our bones. But also it reminds us that we're fragile, we need to acknowledge our weaknesses to really find our strengths.